Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello, our conversation this evening comes from Anne Leslie, the journalist, Edward Blishen, the author, Benny Green, the absolutely everything, and Laurie Taylor, Professor of Sociology at York University. We have music from Jeremy Nicholas. I'm afraid it spoiled the joke time. No, John Barrymore, lazy as he was, didn't miss the San Francisco earthquake. Ray Seabrook of King's Langley, who goes round ruining people's jokes, I think, says Barrymore wrote to his sister Ethel, saying the earthquake had actually turned him out of bed at 4 a.m, but his brother Lionel commented that he'd always said nothing less would have roused him. The joke is better, but I just thought I'd give you the coda, the footnote from Mr. Seabrook. And then the one Nick Tucker told about being in the classroom with the rude word written on the board and saying to the class, will the boy who wrote his name on the board please rub it out? We all laughed. So did Victoria Hall. Not very nice handwriting. Couldn't quite read her address, but at least she says she was making marmalade at the time, usefully occupied. And so did Anne Bradford of New Barnet. Oh, she wasn't making marmalade, or at least not as far as I know, but she laughed too. Both said, goodness me, I read exactly the same story in a book called A Nest of Teachers by Edward Blishen, who also told it in the first person as happening to him. Well, someone was fibbing, but whom? Either or possibly both. Plagiarism on the very doorstep of this programme. How piquant. What's your explanation, Edward?
What can I say? This is like, almost like the Dreyfus case, isn't it? I don't want, I don't really. I've known Nick for a very long time.
You look very undisturbed to me.
I've known Nick for a very long time, and I don't wish, actually, to savage him.
Rub it in.
He clearly is a scoundrel. In this case, he is a scoundrel because he knows perfectly well the story is mine, and had the same story occurred to both of us, and we've known each other for a long time, we would at one point or other have said, good Lord, the same thing happened to both of us.
Turn the knife in the wound.
But, however, I must say that it would take more than that to make a dent in a long friendship. He can steal quite a lot from me still before we actually cease to be friends.
Mitigation, if I ever heard one.
But the worst thing I think about it, really, is his notion that he could tell the story and nobody would ever have read me. So I'm a little alarmed that one of the ladies who read me lives, I think, just round the corner from me, clearly. She's in New Barnet, so it may not be quite so glorious as all that.
Oh, yes, indeed.
But I am nevertheless read, it's clearly.
But that's not too far from Potter's Bar, is it? I mean, within easy distance of.
Indeed, Robert, yes. I should say no more.
No, quite. But I have to say that Nicholas, when asked, said, caught red-handed. But he did claim that the same thing had happened to him, and he simply borrowed your phrase and forgotten about it. But as you rightly point out, well, we'll give him the benefit of the doubt, but plagiarism... It's unconscious often, isn't it?
I was caught out on this programme some years ago, and I was perfectly innocent. I told a story, and it was all true, and I was caught out. We were talking about dreams on this programme, not for the first or last time, and I said that I'd once dreamed a perfect limerick and woken up with it in my mind. I don't know if you remember this, and I recited the limerick. It was a handsome young gourmet from Putney, expired from a surfeit of chutney. Crowds of girl mourners stood weeping in corners, bemused by this outlandish gluttony. And it was one of the better limericks I composed, and I said I'd written it in my dreams. And I remember the year and the place, because I noted it down in a notebook when I woke up. 20 years go by, and I say it on this programme, and so as an example of my subconscious being a better limerickist than I am. 2 days after I said it on the programme, I got a letter from Leslie Charters, the guy that wrote the Saint books and created Simon Templar, and he said, Dear Mr. Green, I'm sure that when you were a teenager you must have been reading my books, because if you turn to volume so-and-so, page so-and-so, you will find your limerick. And indeed I had read all the Saint books when I was 16, and it must have been stuck there in my subconscious. I would have sworn that it was original. Yes, so it's plagiarism, but I was innocent.
Often unconscious.
But that's it. I mean, if somebody had asked me whether I plagiarised anybody, I'd say, of course not, because I'm sure I do it every day and don't know it. The only time I do remember having done it was because it was so recent, and I'm still covered in shame with it, because I was talking to some people from Muswell Hill in a sort of post-mortem on the big freeze, and they were saying Muswell Hill was at a virtual standstill. So somehow or other I forgot to say, as Robert Robinson so wittily said on Stop the Week the other day, I just said, virtual standstill, virtual standstill. It reminds me of one of the more obscure followers of Cromwell, and went round with a pinched mouth and a sugar cone hat and buckled it. And I saw my audience from Muswell Hill laughing fit to burst. Isn't Anne Leslie witty, they said. And I realised, of course, subconsciously or consciously, I had not said, as my friend Robert Robinson said so wittily the other night. And for a moment, I thought, what am I going to do? I love the fact they all think I'm being terribly witty. So I kept quiet about it. But the next day, I was terribly riven with guilt, or rather, riven
You didn't write to them all,
No,
did
I
you?
didn't. I was riven with terror of being
too
found
much.
out, you see. And I thought, even in Muswell Hill, I think some people might have heard Stop the Week, you see. So I rang up the chief Muswell Hiller.
You lost the Muswell Hill vote.
And I rang up about something quite different. And I said, oh, by the way, you know, I was talking about virtual standstill the other day. She had entirely forgotten I had been talking about it, and I went through this embarrassing business of having to admit that I'd pinched it off you. She didn't know what I was talking about.
Exactly, and you know by repeating it, you've knocked it into the ground.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is what Arthur Marshall calls not a joke, but a joketta. And we don't need it repeated
At
twice.
the university, we have committees which are entirely concerned with plagiarism and deciding whether or not plagiarism has indeed occurred. And, of course, it's really rather difficult to know because students do quote or do refer to authorities, and whether or not it's unconscious or not, the problem comes up when the committee then meets and looks at essays and says, well, does this count as plagiarism? Because quite clearly they are quoting from other sources, but are they quoting more from other sources than do those people who are at the moment assessing the degree of plagiarism quote from other sources in their own textbooks? So you can see this becomes a fundamental, and indeed there are cases, and whether or not, just, you know, like Benny talking here, whether or not there's a famous case of a man at a university in America who was a distinguished academic, and he received a paper which was sent to him for external refereeing to decide whether it was suitable for a learned journal. And the person who had written the paper was somewhat surprised a few months later, after knowing that his paper had been sent to an external referee, to open the journal and see his paper printed there. Delighted at first, he thought it must have been immediately accepted, until he saw that the author was the external referee. And when he complained, it was pointed out the external referee had indeed Tipp-X'd out the name of the actual author and inserted his own and simply sent it off to the journal. Now, the man was taken to court and said he couldn't explain his behaviour in any way whatsoever, but somehow all he could say was that when he read it, he felt that he had himself written it.
But, Bob, so much has been done. I mean, I think of my grandson, aged 9, who's just written, following his famous story, Treasure Island by Sam Blishen. He's just written Dracula by Sam Blishen. And I think the whole notion of plagiarism is a late development in human beings, really. And that we move so much in echoes and you know, we've all read so much. There's been so much going on that it's very difficult, actually, to be quite sure what plagiarism is.
Anything is better, Edward, than that dreadful thing of the way in which Americans, when they're giving public lectures, do these little bunny rabbit flicks by their ears when they reach a quotation. They come up to it and they say, and as, do, and they do this little wave with their fingers.
Well, I had a similar experience to Benny's. I read a detective book a long time ago, and one of the reviewers, Margarita Lasky, at the end of saying what she said, I think at some time or another, Robinson must have read a short story by Kipling called Dayspring Mishandled. And as soon as she said it, back it came to me, age 16, there I was, standing up. I was so engrossed, I was standing up and never bothered to sit down in Malden Library reading just that story. And now, the other day, Craig Raine sent me his first-rate anthology of Kipling's prose, and for the first time in all those many years, I was able to reread Dayspring Mishandled. There was the cod Chaucer, there was the cryptogram, there was the revenge motive, but it went even worse than that, where the real writer Kipling had Manor Lace, I had something called Manship. Where he had, I think, Casterly, I had Carsonby. And all I can say is it was demonic possession, because I had totally forgotten the thing. But it had worked its way up through the epiderm, if unconsciousness has an epiderm, and out into my story. We're going to move on a little just before we have some music, because there's a question I've been burning to ask you. You have to tell me this. The man, you know, that man who earns $1 million a year, caught with his pants down, and then there was that rich geezer who got his yacht stuck under Richmond Bridge. You won't have forgotten. Aha, of course you haven't, because I see the smiles creeping over your faces. Why is everyone so pleased at news like this? What is it, my friends? Malice, envy, jealousy? Or when it comes to rejoicing that the rich take a pratfall, is it a good deal more ambivalent? I want the analysis now. Turn your mind from plagiarism and dive into this one.
Well, really,
quick as you like.
the man with the yacht had everything going for him to start off with. I mean, not only was he rich, and we are delighted to see the rich. I will explain that in a moment. But he was also called Sir Donald Gosling. I mean, not Donald Campbell, for goodness' sake. But I mean, here was someone masquerading as a sort of fast waterman, and then he gets it stuck underneath. And then, I mean, the Guardian actually has a Port of London authority man trying, like everyone else, to keep the smirk out of his voice and saying what a great pity it was. But then he's made his money. He's become a millionaire out of car parks. I mean, making your money out of car parks, as everyone knows, I'm certain there must be technical, terribly problems. But I mean, to most of us, it does seem as though it consists of putting a wooden hut at the entrance to a field and then charging everyone who goes past the hut £3.
I wonder if you know. I wonder if you know what an edge there is on your voices. Absolutely, car park. I mean, how snooty can you get, Laurie? I mean, a car park. I think of a bomb site, and I think he might have called it after Beachcomber, as Benny will recognise, referred to one of those yachts or barges as the Saucy Mrs. Flobster. At least he could have called it the Saucy Mrs. Car Park, couldn't he? I'm afraid the same edge is at work on me. Oh, dear.
But I did actually meet a man in the Bahamas who'd made a great deal of money out of soya beans, and in his innocent gratitude, he did actually call his house Soybeaner, and he called his yacht Soybeaner 1, and his smaller yacht Soybeaner 2, and so on down to the line till it got down.
Well,
to
he
the
was a sportsman,
even
though he was rich.
Everybody called him called him and his family Mr. and Mrs. Soybean, and all the children were all known as the little Miss Soybeans. So in a way,
still had the money, though, didn't they?
They still had the money, and in a way, it was like saying, in fact, sneering in return to people like Laurie, saying, "So what? Aren't you sorry that you didn't get into soybeans when we did?" Well,
right. But Benny, what is your feeling about all this?
Oh, envy, malice, and jealousy. And let's not make any bones about it.
No fear.
But when I see a rich man, I say it's wasted on him. Give it to me. I would show you how to be a gentleman with it.
Yes, and Benny will also recognise they always had bad names, didn't they? I mean, in that Johnson play, he just called him Mammon, didn't he? This rich, foolish man.
Sir Epicure Mammon.
Sir Epicure Mammon.
What is it? Sorry, carry on, Edward.
But they've all been called something like that. You remember some time ago, they were an unfortunate couple called the Dockers. Unfortunately rich and unfortunately mocked.
Oh, yes, the Dockers. Yeah, a couple of Dockers.
But Johnson might have invented the name Dockers, mightn't he?
He might. You were going to say something?
I was going to say that one punishment that comes to the rich was visited on an American newspaper tycoon, a multi-millionaire, whose name has lived on, but only as an expletive. Gordon Bennett. He did a lot of stupid things in his life, a lot of rash things.
Immortalised though, as well as
But immortalised, but only in a sort of denigrating way.
Yes, well, don't you think one of the reasons we're so delighted when the rich make idiots of themselves is because one of the things that money is supposed to buy is freedom from ridicule, freedom from being caught really in undignified situations. For example, standing at a bus stop is actually a rather humiliating and undignified thing to do, and the rich can always buy their way out of that. And I remember there was some Duchess of Westminster, now dead, I think, gone to the great bus stop in the sky, and she said anyone seen in a bus after the age of 35 can be considered a failure in life. Now, the great delight in finding that the rich actually get their boats stuck under bridges is that boat didn't buy them the freedom from ridicule.
But let me just say this. It's all very well for us to take our pleasure, but it was only stuck under that bridge for about a day. Why did the smile not leave the rich man's face? I'll tell you, because by the time he rolled under the bridge to the Bahamas or wherever, the rest of us would still be the wrong side of Richmond Bridge, which is where he found us.
But they do get the other... There's always something that goes wrong with their ways of being rich, because we always feel if we're rich, like Benny was suggesting, that we do it far better, because you get the man from Burton's in the topless model story. Even the Guardian actually uses topless as though it was an additional qualification, like chartered accountant, topless model. When it really only presumably means taking the sweater off or something. It's not exactly a great deal of graduate work to be done. But the point
you have to have any money to get hold of the topless model.
But but what he does, but this man who is so rich, you'd think, well, if he was rich and you were conducting, this particular well-publicised affair with the topless model, that you would like to think that you did it with a certain amount of style. But then it's revealed in all the papers, and happily admitted by the person who was involved in the case, that he persuaded her that when she did her dance, then she had to do it in underwear bought from Burton's, and which actually, when she went along to the shop to buy it, she only got a 25% discount off it.
You see, I'm glad you brought Burton's into it, because since we're trying to revenge ourselves on all these rich, happy, wonderful people, Burton's itself was always an object of ridicule. It used to be called Montague Burton, the tailor of Teast. And I always thought that Montague Burton was a close friend of a great hero of this programme, Mr. Barrett, the foot fetishist, who used to walk around accosting people in parks and in byways. And I thought to myself, when Burton's, if you remember, before it was transformed by its present owner, or I mean whoever runs it at the moment, they put cloth outside as though it was an old gypsy establishment. And I thought, I don't think even Mr. Barrett is going to consort any longer with Montague Burton. But I think old Montague is turning in his grave, thinking that here's Mr. Halpern, I should say so, Ralph, eating these peanuts.
The bottomless Mr.
Well,
Halpern.
Montague would never eat peanuts, or is it sunflower seeds? He'd get under his plate.
But I have reason to be delighted that anything should go wrong with Burton, because for some years in my youth, I suffered from wearing the only suit I had, which was a hairy, marmalade-coloured suit, which I had from Burton's, and was very uncomfortable to wear. But what strikes me about the whole thing is that it isn't necessary for rich men's boats to get stuck under bridges, or for them to behave absurdly in bedrooms, for them to be absurd. Actually, human beings are absurd. Richness is a particular kind of absurdity. It really is absurdity with knobs on, isn't it? Most of us, we're all absurd. But the absurdity of being rich, I can't imagine. Who was it who said? Was it Dan who said that richness, one might expect, brought dignity? But it seems to me richness inevitably brings indignity. Because there's something undignified about being rich.
Now we're breathing carefully, we're breathing easily, we have revenged ourselves for the moment on the happy, the rich, and all of that. And so we'll break for a song. Oh, how it's toned us up. Let us have this song. It's sung by Jeremy, and I've got the title of it here, Second Class Values.
I've been called a lot of things in my time, insults that I've had to grin and bear. From feminists and taxi drivers mainly, I ignore them with 2 fingers in the air. Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names they say can never hurt me. There's one name that makes me quail and quake, an insult that I simply cannot take. Say that I'm a con man or a coward, a criminal, a crook, I'll let it pass. But I'm speechless with embarrassment when someone accuses me of being middle class. The face goes red, I lose my head, hit them and then quickly walk away. My defenses have been rumbled and I wilt with humiliating, flagellating guilt. Label me a filthy, rotten pervert, I'll carry on completely undeterred. Blackguard, blighter, bounder, beast, you name it, but never use that hyphenated word. What hurts me most when diagnosed as being slightly left of right of centre is filling my tormentors with delight when they see I know they know, I know they're right. The working class are always proud to be so. The salt, so they will tell you, of the earth. The upper classes couldn't give a monkey's, though you call them twits and Burks for all you're worth. Neither of them care when tempers flare if the middle classes call them plebs or snobs. They'll turn round and kick you up the Khyber Pass by describing you as deeply middle class. The predictable old-fashioned middle class. The values of the boring middle class, the toffee-nosed and stuffy middle class, the smug, self-satisfying middle class.
Well, class again. Thank you, Jeremy. Class again. Can't leave it alone for long. I have a report, I think we all saw it in the papers during the week, says more and more people are joining the middle class. And when I read the news, I wondered, how odd. So many people aspiring to a condition whose very name has always inspired derision and contempt. Why, I found myself wondering in my monkish way, why is it that middle class is a term of abuse? And further, why is it a term of abuse in so many different ways? I laid aside the capital letter I was illuminating and decided to seek your worldly advice.
I think,
Right,
Bobby, it's
right.
really the word middle is what's at stake here, really, because middle is a terribly unexciting word. And I think everybody's slightly ashamed of being in the middle. Everybody would like to be at the ends, at the interesting extremities, really. Bernard Shaw talked about their petty vices of unsociability flourishing like mushrooms in a cellar. And now what it strikes me is that the awful petty vices of the middle class are petty vices of sociability. You can't escape from them. We're all awfully affable to each other, those in the middle
You
class.
remember something else Shaw said when Alfred Doolittle apologises for his change in behaviour, and he says the excuse is, well, it's middle-class morality.
And he said, I can't afford it.
Well,
Oh,
yeah,
was that-
originally, I can't afford morals.
Yeah,
Then
but-
somebody leaves him a lot of money, and he shrugged his shoulders and said, middle-class morality, what's done me?
But it's interesting that the middle class is the class that is incredibly self-conscious. I mean, you
True,
don't say
true.
to somebody, oh, goodness, how upper class, or goodness, how working class, if they've said or done something. The reason it's so self-conscious, of course, is because it's not a static class. It is constantly measuring itself against all the other social markers on the landscape and wondering whether it's slipped or whether it's rising. And it's upper middle class tends to say, oh, how middle class, when they mean lower middle class, i.e. smug, people who've got values like Woody Allen said of his parents, of God and carpeting. And it's because the upper middle class or the newly risen upper middle class are terrified that you might think that they were down with the lower middle class. So that there's this constant shifting around, finding out where you
Yes,
are.
it is. You see, you could put it even more scientifically. I mean, you could make a theorem almost out of it that those who distinctly belong to what is still charmingly called the working class and what is still charmingly called the upper classes are absolutely certain about their behaviour. Each of those sections, those sectors, don't give a good goddamn. They really don't. Whereas in the middle class straddles both, and therefore is continuously, I don't know that it's got much to do with the assimilation of more and more people, it's just that continuously it's preoccupied with the way you behave, because they are neither working class nor upper class, and their pretensions therefore come in for, jeering. They come in for stick from both ends of the social scale. The Duke and the Dustman, they don't give a hoot, but the middle class
But more
always
than that,
dithers.
Bob, Scott, more than that, because Godfrey Smith caught it when he said that the middle class is a term of abuse used by the English for those who made them what they are. And it is, in a way, the difficult thing of coping with the fact that it is the parents, or our parents, or teachers, or it was the people who were the vicars, or it was the people who were moral guardians in some way, that these were the people who were middle class and who told us what to do. And if we now say that we are ourselves middle class, then we are aligning ourselves with those people who we have to say that we've gone against. And the problem is with the word middle class is that there aren't enough distinctions that you can make within it. Because, I mean, Anne says, yes, there's upper middle and lower middle, but no one ever describes themselves in those terms. No one ever says, I am lower middle class. No one has ever said that, except those people who believe themselves not to be
To have
already.
risen out
I
of
think it's your
I
turn,
definitely
Edward.
believe that the lower middle class predicament is a very different thing, and people do know they're in the lower middle class, and it's a particular kind of discomfort even now, though it was acuter, I think, a few years ago. But what I notice is that I think Bob's point about it is being an uneasy position to occupy. The working class know who they are, and they can behave freely as working class people. The upper class know who they are and can behave freely too. But I live in a totally middle class neighbourhood, and I'm a totally middle class member of it. And I notice I sit working every day facing a field in which my neighbours take their dogs walking. And I notice that they affect actually all kinds of jolly working class apparel. And actually it's extraordinarily expensive. I sometimes look out and think all the expense that has been devoted to all these people with their dogs looking terribly working class, and they don't succeed. I remember my father mother, who was really working class, being terribly upset when I wore as a boy, as a young man, as a youth, corduroy clothes. And I wondered why he was so upset. And I understood when, in fact, my own children wore denim, because, in fact, that's the adoption of, as it were, the cloth of the working class of one's youth. And I think it is that movement into that adoption, the uneasy adoption of other people's materials and so on.
I can't understand this obsession with what one wears. It seems to me to be a form of insanity. And I've never...
You're above it, you're saying.
Well, no, I may even be beneath
you
it,
look
but
pretty
I'm
smartly
beyond...
dressed to me. You're the only one with a tie on, mate.
No, if you
Far be it
remember...
from me to mention the
socks and the sandals, you see, that was... And it leads me to the point where a man wears socks and sandals, there is a case to be made out for the fact that he belongs to a category we haven't mentioned yet, and to which I suspect we may all belong, and that's the group of us who are déclassés. By our position in society, we are
wandering
all
vagabond again.
We are all vagabonds.
We get one or two of them in here.
We are all for hire. None of us do a steady, regular, respectable job. Not one of us. We all do what the middle class would say.
Well, this brings me...
we are déclassés.
We have to say this. In all honesty, we have to say, I agree with what you said earlier, that once upon a time, middle class was a term of abuse because it applied to stockbrokers who lived in Dorking and were understood never to open a book. Earthbound Philistine. But if I were to tease out a rather personal, for all of us, thread from the warp and woof of, if that's the phrase I want, of abuse into which the phrase middle class has been stitched, it now can apply to people whose conversation is, what shall I say, a little too fanciful, a little too speculative, who in fact jeer at crossword puzzles and bridge and all the stockbrokers and Dorking and Weybridge and so forth. And more than once, as you know, we've had letters here abusing us under the term middle class. Now, this is where I come to it. My feeling is that our critics don't actually mean middle class when they use the word, or I should say the phrase, to clobber us. I suspect that what they're saying is that we use the instruments of a formal education with an offhandedness which doesn't allow that this is not available to everyone else. And even allowing for the number of times this offhandedness is done for ironic purposes or done deliberately because we know it teases, there's an element of truth in that criticism.
Well, it's because we're using a kind of intellectual clothing to identify our group. I call us the chattering classes, and I don't think they're confined to people in this studio, though. There's a whole group of people who belong to the chattering classes who are constantly doing exactly what our listeners say we do. And I think in a way it's a kind of intellectual clothing. Instead of sort of wearing the denim or wearing the cords or something, which are class labels, we're doing it with sort of throwing in the odd quotation from Spinoza. Not that I do, but still.
That's nice.
No,
having it both ways.
Or, for example, I mean, people who call their cats Spinoza or Plato. It's a kind of throwaway.
It's a kind of airiness, you see,
Yes.
which either amuses or annoys, but it's one more thing which gets the phrase middle class,
self-satisfaction.
which gets the
Yes,
word
but why we-
middle class a bad name.
Yes, I know, but we
Self-satisfaction,
fear-
most of all. It is the idea that there is a line drawn around this little club. It says, because the letters also say, you know, the ones that I've seen say that it's too clubby, you know, and that it's...
Oh, that's quite a different
No,
thing.
it isn't, because you see, the middle class thing, if you actually look at the origin, if you take something like the word bourgeois itself, it actually refers, you know, to places, to the burgs, to places where little groups of people who couldn't get any protection...
They never
in the
call us
castle,
bourgeois.
No, but
Middle class is the insult.
But the insult is the idea that the middle class, in fact, go away and shut themselves away from contact with everybody else, that they, in fact, insulate themselves in their little area. And I think that what is being said is that this sounds like a self-congratulatory club, and that is really like a little tiny metaphor. It's a little miniature version of the middle class that we've established here.
There's another group I've just thought of that we haven't mentioned. There is another group in society, symbolised by an uncle of mine many years ago, who resolutely refused to do anything in the way of labour. And one day he started and he became a street bookmaker. And it was said of him in the family that he was upwardly mobile and had now joined the working classes. But what class he belonged to before that, I do not know.
I think, you see, really the point is not... We as chatterers, and chatterers who might mention Spinoza, or just, I mean, chatterers, in that sense in which we are chatterers, are not typical of the middle class. I think...
we are déclassés.
No, we're
well,
not.
I know, we are déclassés.
Press on, Edward.
But also, you see, Granville Barker says somewhere, comfort came in with the middle class. I think comfort is the point. The middle class are people who want to make themselves comfortable in the world. They want to make themselves comfortable in the world, and therefore they are guilty about this because they know that it's very wicked to want to be comfortable. And in fact, being comfortable is a very sensible desire, but it's also a very wicked one.
Grandfather
but
Barker
comfortable,
shouldn't talk.
I mean,
marry a millionaire to stop working for the rest of his life.
Comfortable. I mean, are we talking about psychically comfortable or comfortable in the form of sofas? I think that one of the great anxieties of the middle class is that they want to be psychically comfortable, and that's why little things to do with etiquette matter so much. Now, America, for example, which is a very mobile society, in fact, one survey on what Americans would most like to be, in what class would they most like to belong, they said upper middle class. And when you think that all the sort of modern etiquette books, they all started in America. They were Amy Vanderbilt and Emily Post and that kind of thing. When I worked for Playboy, the biggest volume of letters, that magazine, which is supposed to be very un-middle class, very free, very sort of free-spirited, naked, and all the rest of it. The biggest volume of letters used to come to a section of the magazine called the Playboy Advisor, and it came from chaps, sort of computer programmers who lived in places like Akron, Ohio, who spent sleepless nights not grappling, as the Burton boss did, with topless lovelies, as the magazine sort of more or less implied that they should be, but grappling with these agonizing things that should they, when they went to a smart restaurant, ask the maitre d' to let them sniff the cork.
One of the ways the term is used to abuse people is to abuse their gentility. You may remember a few years ago there was a Labour politician who went round saying that people in Bristol were more interested in having brass door knockers on their doors than they were of being on the barricades. Now, in a simple way, I thought the reason you went on the barricades was to get brass door knockers for absolutely everyone. And I may say this, or indeed I may, if I'm not interrupted, who knows? A more blameless emblem of progress than the brass door knocker you won't imagine. A vote for blogs is a vote for brass door knockers, or even a vote for brass door knockers is a vote for blogs. But no, brass door knockers are irredeemably middle class,
yes,
and it's an insult.
I find absolutely so moving is, in fact, that kind of late 60s sociologist who fell in love with a kind of noble prole idea of working class and used to go round to these villages and write sociological profiles about how they scrub the doorsteps and things in the morning, and how, you know, the noble prole idea, the myth of working class life, and then got terribly disappointed because, of course, as soon as the noble prole got a bit of money, he put in not only a brass door knocker, but he actually put in things like fake Georgian doors.
On the question of abuse,
Chairman recognises Laurie Taylor there. On the question of abuse
and the question of plagiarism, I can recall on this programme, on one occasion about sort of 4 or 5 years ago, when Bob had gone in for a long account of some aspect of life or other, and the person sitting very close to him around these tables suddenly leant across and said to him, "You know, Bob, that's very, very middle class." And I can remember you looking up and just simply saying, "Is it? Oh, good."
Well, then I should say that it's time this middle-class coterie returned home to see if Nanny has set the house on fire. Though I must say, in closing, I just do not believe that any individual person feels himself determined by any class whatsoever. Class is just a way of categorizing other people.
Anne Leslie, Edward Blishen, Benny Green and Professor Laurie Taylor were stopping the week with Robert Robinson. Jeremy Nicholas provided the musical interlude, and the programme was produced by Michael Amber.